My name is Vartkess Tarbassian. I'm a native of Boston, Massachusetts, born in 1932. I presently live in Framingham, Massachusetts, and I've been a Framingham resident for approximately 50 years now.
And school that you went? Did you go to school here?
I did go to school yes, I'm native born. I went to school in Boston. I completed high school in Boston and subsequently completed a degree program at Northeastern University.
Oh, when was it? When was it?
1975.
Oh. Well, when did you join the military?
I was drafted by the military in November 1952.
Hmm. So what were you doing when you were drafted?
I had recently graduated from high school, and I was working as a sheet metal worker in Boston, Massachusetts.
And how did you feel when you were drafted? Did you know that you were about to go to Korea?
I didn't even know where Korea was. I had to look it up on the map, and I was not anxious to be drafted, but I felt it was my obligation. It was something I wanted to pay back to the country, the United States, for all the privileges and rights that I enjoyed then and I still enjoy today.
You said you're ethnically from Armenia.
My parents are from Armenia.
Could you tell me about the history of your family when they came to the United States? And
Certainly. Both my parents were driven out of the country of Armenia by the Turks. It was a cultural disagreement. It's a religious disagreement somewhat. We happen to be Christian. The Turks are Muslims. And never the two will meet, not in that area of the Middle East, unfortunately. When my parents immigrated to the United States and Canada, my mother was from Canada.
When was that?
Approximately 1925 or so. My father settled in the greater Boston area. My mother was raised as a teenager in Canada, and they met through a matchmaking.
Really?
Yes.
Wow, there was a matchmaking kind of institution at the time?
Oh, yes. Well, they were all immigrants, and that's the way they did things, evidently, in the old country.
Mm-hmm. And how was your sort of growing up in Armenian family? Any distinctive cultural aspect that you want to share?
Very disciplined. My father made certain that I, as a male member of the family, in particular the oldest child, was to carry on the cultural obligations of an immigrant, which were make sure your child goes to college, make sure you have a business of your own, and lastly, make sure you have a home of your own.
Mm. Were there many Armenians around your neighbors?
The Armenians congregated in one general area, which is Watertown, Massachusetts, where the Chechens had their recent episode, unfortunately.
Right. But it's just one of them, not all of the communities, so we shouldn't blame the community.
No, we don't. No. I don't. That would be unfair.
Yeah.
That would be unfair.
So you were drafted, but you were honored to serve your country.
I certainly was.
Mm-hmm. So, tell me about your military basic training.
After spending approximately 10 days of induction in the Fort Devens area in Massachusetts, I was transferred into Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, for basic training. Basic training at that time ran 16 weeks. 8 weeks was very basic, which was introducing you to close order drill, rifle practice, military courtesy, that kind of thing. And subsequently, the last 8 weeks of the cycle, I spent in learning advanced infantry techniques and larger weapons.
What kind? Could you tell me details?
Well, beyond the rifle, I certainly was taught how to use rocket launchers, mortars, recoilless rifle, rifle grenades, that sort of thing.
How was it? Were you scared or?
I was very uncomfortable, to say the least. One particular incident in basic training scared the heck out of me, I must be honest, and that was when they have a tank drive over your foxhole. And you better stay in that foxhole because you're not going to be happy otherwise.
Right. How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I have one brother and two sisters. One is deceased.
Any older brother?
No, I'm the oldest.
Oh, you're the oldest. So what was the sort of reaction from your family that you are supposed to go to Korea?
My father particularly was very unhappy when I got drafted. That was one of the few times in my life that I saw my father get choked up and cry. He did not want me to go into the service at all. He, as a matter of fact, walked me from our home to the draft board where I was met by a bus, which subsequently took me to the Army base. But he did not take it well. My mother was a very stoic woman. She was very strong. She did not let on to me as far as any sobbing was concerned or any hand-wringing was concerned. She bit her upper lip. My siblings, they thought it was something that everybody went through. Everybody had to be drafted. And at that time, millions were drafted. So it was commonplace to see somebody leave home for the military.
Have you known anything about Korea before you left for Korea?
No. I had to look it up on the map. I really had to seek out where Korea was. I had an idea it was in the Orient, but I didn't know exactly where in the Orient it was located.
So, after you finished the military, the basic military training, where did you go and when did you leave for Korea? From where?
I had my basic, and then I was what was called frozen in place. They use quotation marks around the word frozen. I was kept at Indiantown Gap for a period of 16 more weeks and acted as a cadreman for incoming recruits. And when the recruit cycle was completed, it was determined, I believe, that Fort Indiantown Gap would be closed as an Army training facility, so they had to send me somewhere. And what they did was they sent me to what was called FECOM, Far East Command. And my orders were cut for the Far East Command. I was given a 10-day furlough and spent my 10 days in Boston with my parents and friends, and then took a train from Boston to New York, changed trains from there to Chicago, and changed trains again from Chicago to Seattle. And that was a long trip, and it was a delightful trip because I was treated very courteously by the train's staff, the conductors and the porters. They were all very nice people who treated me like a gentleman. I went first class. As a matter of fact, they gave me a first-class compartment, which was very unusual. I expected to go from coast to coast on a troop train. It didn't happen.
How many soldiers were in the same train?
3.
That's all?
That's all.
Oh, that's why you've been treated.
I was treated royally. First-class meals, first-class accommodations.
Do you remember how your father reacted when you went to Boston for the last time before you left for Korea? And your family? Anything that you remember?
Well, other than that episode of walking to the draft board and watching him get choked up, that was something else. He escorted me. The draft board was on the second floor of a building, and
but that was when you were drafted. But I'm talking about when you had the
orders to go to Korea.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that he was not a very happy man. That's for certain. He had said that he had come to the United States to raise a family, not to see a family get splintered. And he was very
He
unhappy.
is right.
Yeah, well, that's what happened. And
Did you have a girlfriend at the time?
I met a girl at that time in the last 10 days on my furlough. And we kept corresponding for quite a while.
So that means that you wrote back to her.
Yes, I did.
Do you
Yes, I did.
still keep that letters?
Do I?
Do you still keep that letters?
No, no.
Did she keep the letter?
We broke up, so she returned the letters.
And what happened to that letters? Did you?
I threw them away before my current wife saw them.
Okay, so let us talk about. So you took the ship from Seattle, right?
Yes.
And how long did it take, and when did you arrive where, and tell me about those.
The ship was the USS General Collins. It took us 14 days to cross to Yokohama, Japan.
When do you remember when did you left for Yokohama from Seattle?
It was during the summer, the late summer of 1953, I believe.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So the war was over, or what?
The war was over, but it was still considered a combat zone. And I was heading for a combat zone.
Mm-hmm.
Fully armed, fully loaded, all the time I was there.
Anything that particularly you remember in Japan while you stayed just
Oh, yes.
briefly?
Well, Japan, something unusual happened to me. Now, the ship docked initially at Yokohama. And I was hoping that maybe I'd get assigned someplace in Yokohama instead of Korea. It didn't happen that way. What they did was they disembarked a number of Air Force servicemen, and the Army stayed on board. The ship moved out the following evening from Yokohama to Sasebo, Japan, right outside, very close to Nagasaki.
Mm-hmm.
And I was hoping now again that I'd get a chance to stay in Japan rather than go to Korea. What happened was my name got called.
Your name?
I was asked to get off the boat. I was told to get off the boat.
Yeah.
And I was put on a train. And the train took me to Itajima, which is where the Japanese Naval Academy was. And at Itajima, I was trained to be a radio operator. And my military occupational specialty, my MOS, was changed from infantryman to radio operator. I went to 14 weeks of school there.
In Japan.
In Japan at Itajima, completed the course successfully, and thereafter it was immediately shipped back to Sasebo, put on a ferry, and landed in Busan.
Do you remember when you arrived in Busan?
December 1953.
What kind of skill did they taught you? Did they teach you?
As a radio operator?
Yeah.
Well, they introduced me to all sorts of radios. Portable radios, which you strap to your back, handheld radios, and also radios in a truck.
Was it difficult to learn, or?
Well, it was very rapid learning. If you did not learn, you were kicked out of the school. You were immediately shipped to Korea as an infantryman. I was a good student. I became a very good student.
All right. So, what was the first impression when you arrived in Korea? What did you feel?
Oh my goodness! When they took us off the ship in Japan, in Busan, and put us in a squad tent for the evening, I was very, very shocked by what I saw in Korea. Having left Japan with all the niceties and comforts, suddenly being thrust into a combat zone where there were no niceties, no comforts, was like a light switch on the wall, going from light to dark instantly. Mm-hmm. The surrounding land was all marred by constant fighting. It was obvious there was fighting all around that general area, and you could see that the devastation was surrounding Busan. Yes, the perimeter of Busan was very badly pockmarked with shell holes and bomb holes, and it was not a happy place to be. People looked like they were hungry, the Korean people I'm speaking about. They looked like they needed shelter. They needed clothing, obviously. The basic elements of life were not visible. I don't know how the people survived 3 years of fighting and then recovered so quickly. Today's Korea amazes me. I'm amazed by what I've heard about Korea.
So from Busan, where did you go?
From Busan, I was trucked directly to Yeongdong-po. And it was a holding area, what was known as a repo depot, a replacement depot. And I was placed in the repo depot for a day when assignments were made for the number of troops that were in the area. I was told that I was going to go to the 2nd Infantry Division, and once again I was picked up by a vehicle and trucked out to Chowan, and I stayed in Chowan for the rest of my time.
Until when?
November 1954.
So please tell me about the typical day of your service at Chowan. How was the situation? What was going on? What was going on right after the armistice and so on?
Being shipped from Yeongdong-po to Chowan was an experience because I saw even further devastation. This was where more active fighting had gone on more recently rather than back at Busan. And the people that I saw looked even worse than what I had seen in the Busan area. Unfortunately, they were catching the brunt of the most recent fighting. But I was put in the Jeep and taken up to Chowan, and it was a short drive. Korea is not that wide at that point, the peninsula. So it took maybe an hour or two to get from Seoul to Chowan. And I got there late in the evening, but my hosts were waiting for us, for me and my buddy, Pepe Shina, who I may talk to you about a little bit later, perhaps. And the company commander was there. He greeted us, and the first sergeant, John Graham, was there. The first sergeant was a bear of a man, not a very happy man. And you didn't enjoy being around him because he was tough as nails, a very hardened combat veteran, tough man. They did not have room at the inn, so to speak, for Pepe and I, Paul and I. And the first sergeant said, well, I've got your lodgings ready. You climb that hill up there, and there's a machine gun waiting for you. You get up there, and you wait until I tell you to come down. And we did. We spent the first evening there. We spent the second evening there. And finally the third evening.
Without any shelter?
No shelter, just a hole in the ground with a hole in the ground facing north with a machine gun.
And that was January or what?
January 54. We were full alert still.
So must be deadly cold.
It was cold. January is very cold.
How did you sleep then?
I couldn't sleep. I could not sleep. Pepe slept. I don't know how, but I could not.
Did you have a sleeping bag?
No. They had the clothes on our back.
You kidding me?
No.
You slept in January of 1954.
For 3 nights. For 3 nights, I did not sleep. I did not sleep. During the day, we were relieved. We came down, had our chow, and then we were sent back up again.
God, it must be so cold.
It was cold. It was very, very cold. I was not comfortable. That's putting it mildly.
Why didn't they provide you sleeping bags?
I have no idea. I have no idea. When we arrived at our company headquarters, we were given our instructions to go up the hill, and we were also issued a rifle and a full load of ammunition. And that's all we were given. A canteen with water. We had some water. So up we went. And finally, after the third day, there was room at the inn, so to speak, and we were assigned to the radio squad, which was a 8-man tent heated by an oil burning stove, 2 of them, 1 on each end. And I had a cot, and I was issued a sleeping bag. During that time, there was a light sleeping bag, I might add. During that time, I slept very frequently with my clothes on inside the sleeping bag. We were told never to zip up our sleeping bags because in the event of an emergency, we'd have to get out fast. So I would sleep with my gloves on and my boots on inside the sleeping bag and my cap on my head. My rifle was always at the side of my bunk.
Well, what was the situation there? You were confronting North Korean and Chinese army there,
No,
right?
no. I was with Headquarters Company at that time.
Okay.
And Headquarters Company was where there was a concentration of radio operators, a concentration of trucks and cooks and what have you. So I was assigned to be a radio operator in a 3/4-ton truck. And we would have rotating shifts now, so that I would probably go out and work 8 hours in the truck, which had a heater in it, I might add, which was comfortable in that respect. And then somebody would come and relieve me, and we'd just keep going day after day into that truck. 8-hour shifts. Now, there were a number of us radio operators. There were perhaps 9 radio operators, so 2 to a shift would go into that radio truck. That was my duty for a period of months, and it was quite boring, to say the least. There was no action going on at that time, other than guerrillas.
Oh,
No,
tell me about that.
Now, the guerrillas used to sneak into our tent area often, and we would have sentries walking around the area, armed to the teeth. I had a pull duty one evening, as a matter of fact, as a sentry, walking around the company perimeter. One incident that I recall, which was rather comical at the time, but it served to anger me a little too, happened when, as I was walking, there was a drunken Army major walking by me, and in the darkness of the morning, he stopped and asked me if I saluted him. I thought that was ridiculous, but I said, yes, I did. Okay? And okay, he smiled and he went on his way. That was a farcical moment of sentry duty that I endured. Other times when the guerrillas used to come in, they would sneak preferably into a officer's area because the officers had better living conditions than the enlisted men did. They had better everything.
Yeah.
So the guerrillas would sneak in there and look for weapons and money while the officers were asleep. Not all officers slept well. So more than once I had an occasion where gunfire would go off in the company area as an officer or a sentry would chase a guerrilla away and a thief away. So it was not unusual to see the guerrillas coming in to arm themselves and the thieves coming to get the money or food or whatever clothing they could steal. So there were 2 types of unauthorized people entering our camp area at that time.
Was there any moment that was really, you were facing a real danger?
Yes, that was inside the DMZ later.
When was it? Tell me about that, please.
Okay. During the summer of '54, the Army decided that the 2nd Division should come home to the United States. I still had time to serve in Korea. I had only spent about 6 months at that time. So the Army said, you're not going home with the division. You're going to stay here and serve out your time. And you're going to the 3rd Infantry Division, the 15th Regiment, INR platoon, INR meaning Intelligence and Reconnaissance. I did arrive at the assigned position, and I was greeted by a commanding officer, a lieutenant, and first sergeant there also. And they welcomed me in, and they said to me that they would like me to be a DMZ observer. I had no idea what they were talking about. So I said, fine. I mean, I was what was considered a short timer by then. In other words, I was going to go home very soon. So nothing could happen to me after all this. My God. Being young, you feel indestructible for once in a while. But I was told to go up on what was known as White Horse, where the Rock Army fought like heck, and won many a battle, I might add, against the Chinese communists. I was also sent up to Arrowhead, and lastly I was sent up to Alligator Jaws. Those are the 3 hills that I went up as a DMZ observer. One of those times that I went up as a DMZ observer in the evening, there was a tremendous blast in the area. Now, mind you, I was a single observer, 1 man to an outpost, 8 hours, looking directly at the North Koreans who were looking at me.
A scary mission.
It is. It is. And my job was to gather information. So, as I said, had this tremendous blast go off. It felt it under my feet. What the North Koreans were doing, they were tunneling. These are the tunnels that you hear about. They had already begun their tunneling in the summer.
Really, at the time already?
Yes, yes, oh yes. I believe they were tunneling. And they were crossing the DMZ below ground at that time. So that was a scary moment. A comical moment happened also. You might want to hear about that. I was told that I would have to train a rock soldier. Now, this rock soldier was rather young, younger than me, and I was only 22 at the time. He was very young. I'd say he was maybe 19 or 18. And he was a reluctant soldier. He did not want to go face these people facing us. And when I say facing us, Doctor, I mean as close as you and I. Okay? All there is a barbed wire strung between us. We're all a barbed wire. He was very reluctant, but fortunately for him, we went up in the dark that evening to the bunker. We stayed in the bunker overnight. The sun came up the following morning. And I said to the soldier through motion, because we couldn't speak each other's language, I said, come on out, come on out. And he understood, and he came out of the bunker, and this is when the North Koreans spotted him. And as they spotted him, they did not like what they saw. They came tumbling out of their bunker, running towards the middle, the dead line we called it, the middle strand of barbed wire, rolled wire, concertina wire, strung between us, evidently calling him names in Korean. They were saying things to him in Korean. He ran. He ran right back up the hill to into the bunker. He was so frightened. This was his first day in the DMZ, so I can understand that. But also being confronted by people who had aggressive thoughts scared the heck out of him. So that, I thought it was funny, but he didn't think it was funny.
But it wasn't threatening you?
They weren't threatening me. They did not like him because he was,
Why?
I guess because he was an Asian or a South Korean.
Ah.
He was the enemy.
How close between you and the enemy at the time?
Very close. They would march right down to the wire.
Like 100 yards?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So
That
you
area.
were able to watch North Koreans moving?
Oh, yes. I could see them very clearly walking back and
What
forth.
do they do?
They were inspecting the wire, the barbed wire. They were walking and joking sometimes in broad daylight. They're very bold people, the North Korean soldiers are very bold. They don't know fear too much.
Now you feel like a daydreaming about it, right?
Well, I had many a nightmare when I came home.
Oh, you suffer from PTSD?
No, not anymore, I don't think. But I haven't had one of those dreams in years, thank God.
Oh.
Initially, I did. When I came home, I would have nightmares. My mother would wake me up, and she'd, shake me and wake me up. And it took about a year or more for me to get rid of those nightmares. But they dissolved, gradually dissolved.
How much were paid?
$72 a month.
It varies a lot because some of them say 132 and you are saying 75.
I was a private.
Okay.
Private.
So what did you do with the money?
A portion of it was always removed from my pay in the manner of war bonds. So $25 a month was taken out every month while I was in the service. I had agreed to that. The balance of it I kept as military scrip, they call it, in my wallet. Whenever somebody was given a 10-day pass, they came to me for a loan because I had all kinds of money. I couldn't spend it. I never left the line. I never went to Seoul. I only had one Scotia R&R, and that was 3 days. While in the Chowan. That's as far back as I got.
Oh.
So I was online all the time. All the time.
I mean, there's supposed to be a sort of a break, right?
There was
For
a break.
every
They called
soldier,
it the
but you
Scotia.
refused?
No. I think at the time, if you had spent 6 months there, they gave you 3 days back as the Scotia R&R rotation.
Yeah.
If you spent a year there, I think it was, now you got the big rotation. You were sent to Japan for 10 days. So I only spent 10 months in Korea. So I didn't qualify, obviously,
Okay.
for that.
Looking back all those years, what do you think is the contribution that made by the Korean War veterans about what Korea is now? What is the legacy of Korean War and Korean War veterans?
Our legacy is, I think, the fondest gratitude by the South Korean people and their government. I am amazed by how welcomed we are, how grateful the Korean people have been to not only the United States, but to the UN forces that fought there. We have done much to help the Korean people, but they've helped themselves quite a bit too, I might add. My legacy is, my wish would be that the Korean nation continue to prosper as it has so far.
Have you been back to Korea?
No, I haven't. I have not been to Korea. I'm not a good traveler, unfortunately. There was one other incident that I wanted to share with you, and that was about the troops, the other UN troops, if you'd like to hear that.
Yeah.
Okay. The American general at the time, this is while I was with the 2nd Infantry Division, the American general had observed that the Turkish and Greek troops would not fight the way he wanted them to fight, the North Koreans and the Chinese. What they were doing, what the Greeks and the Turks were doing, is rather than shoot their rifles at the aggressors, they would use the rifle as a spear. They were always bayoneting. They wanted a bayonet rather than shoot the enemy.
But was it set so close to each other, the enemies and Greeks and Turks?
The Turks would always supposedly invite the communists to come up the hill. Get close enough to me so I can bayonet you. They would hold their fire, deliberately hold their fire. This was true for the Greeks too. The American general was very unhappy, so he sent orders down through channels to get some volunteers, American volunteers, to go to the Greeks and to the Turks and show them how to shoot the rifle instead of using it as a spear.
You mean they didn't know how to shoot?
They certainly did. They did, but it's a cultural thing. Remember, they have always used cold steel as a weapon in the Middle East. Swords, knives. So they prefer, at least these are professional killers, these Turks and Greeks. They're professionals. They're not drafted necessarily. These guys volunteer. So anyway, 10 of us were asked to volunteer. I happen to be Armenian. The Armenians don't coexist well with the Turks.
As you mentioned in the beginning.
Yes, there's a cultural difference here.
Right.
I wanted to go to see how the Turks behaved, especially if there were an Armenian in their midst.
But obviously you didn't tell them that you're from Armenia, right?
Wait. They came through the ranks, the sergeant and the The captain came through our ranks asking for 10 volunteers. 5 of us would be shipped to the Greek compound, and 5 would be shipped to the Turkish compound to show these troops how to shoot the M1 rifle, the American rifle. I stepped forward. I wanted to go and see how the Turks behaved. And as they came down taking names, they got to me, and the captain said, "Okay, Sergeant, send this man to the Turkish compound." And the sergeant said, "Sir, you can't do that." He said, "Why not, Sergeant?" He said, "Because he's Armenian." Oh, no, send him to the Greeks. So I got shipped off to the Greeks. A lieutenant and I took a ride soon thereafter to the Greek compound, which happened to be in a dried out, a mucky rice paddy. And we were told that we would be greeted by a Greek officer. He did show up, and we got out of our Jeep, and the Greek officer said, "I will assemble our troops now, and we'd like the demonstration to take place in our parking area, our assembly area." So the lieutenant and I stood there while they formed all around us in a big circle. The lieutenant said, "Okay, soldier, now I'd like you to show them the various 4 firing positions of the M1 rifle." And I assumed a position of a standing firing position. They stopped. They said, "Are there any questions?" Nobody had any questions. "Now take the seating position." I got down in the mud and sat down, and I went through the firing motions. "Are there any questions?" There were no questions. Now he said, "I want you to get into the kneeling position." I got down into the mud, and once again, any questions? There were no questions. We looked around, and everybody seemed lollygagging. They looked like they're bored. The Greek soldiers were bored. So he said, "All right, soldier, the last position is the prone position. Get down on your belly in the mud, and let's go through this motion." In the meantime, the lieutenant, the Greek lieutenant, was embarrassed by the behavior of his troops, but he didn't say anything. So I get down into the prone position. I went through the motions of how to fire the M1 from the prone position, and the lieutenant said, "Are there any questions?" And once again, there were no questions. So he said, "All right, soldier, get up." So I got out of the mud, covered now with mud, cold and miserable, uncomfortable. What happened was the Greek officer said to his troops in Greek, I guess, because this led to something. He said, "I would like you to show us how the American soldier uses his bayonet." So the lieutenant said, "All right, soldier, fix bayonet." So I got my bayonet and put it on my rifle. He said, "All right, soldier, go through the positions of how to use the bayonet." So I did the butt stroke and the slash and the lunge positions, and I got all kinds of applause. Now, suddenly the Greek soldiers were all smiling, and they got a kick out of what was going on. This was more to their liking. This was more to their behavior.
Got it.
So that was an episode. When we completed the demonstration shortly thereafter, I was one of the boys now. All the Greek soldiers were gathered around me, and just saying things to me in broken English or what have you. But it went over well. The Greek officer was pleased finally by the behavior of his troops, and he said, "Let us now have a bite to eat." So they fed the lieutenant and I, and we left soon thereafter. Never again were we invited, any of us volunteers, any of the 10 of us were never invited back again, except for our 2. The lieutenant and I got a standing invitation. Anytime you guys want to come back, come on back. That was quite an experience on how foreign troops behave with one another, and how foreign troops, meaning UN troops in this case, would behave in battle. And remember, these are hardened veterans.
That's a very interesting story I ever heard. What do you how people treat you when you return to the United States? Do you remember?
The Korean people or the American people?
American people, when you returned to
When I came back,
from Korea to the United States?
when I came back to Boston, I was a non-entity. I did not exist as far as the American public was concerned. Korea was not a popular war. I've said this before about Korea. It was right on the heels of World War II. The American public did not want any more wars after World War II, and suddenly there was Korea happening. So I was not well received. I didn't get an attaboy from anybody. No veterans approached me. The public didn't approach me. Only my parents and my immediate family.
How was your father reacting to your return?
Well, he did something very unusual for him. My father was a teetotaler. He did not drink alcohol. When I came home, he was seated in the living room, and I was told that he was waiting for me by my mother. And I went to see him, and he reached down beside his chair, and he had a six-pack waiting, and he handed it to me. I was amazed. I was shocked that he was doing this. He didn't have any beer, but he gave me a six-pack because now he had a son who was coming home. And this was his way of inviting me back and giving me some kind of a reward for my service. Quite an experience for me.
So you
Very
said
emotional.
that you did work to get the degree in 1975. Could you tell me?
I was a full-time employee for Honeywell Computer Company at the time. I was working in their purchasing department as a buyer. I wanted to move up in the ranks, and the only way to move up in the ranks was to earn a degree. And Honeywell as a company would pay your full tuition and your the cost of your books, as long as you got a passing grade, a B or better. It took me 10 years nights to earn my degree from 0 semester hours. I went 3 times.
What university?
Northeastern. They have a co-op program there. But they also have a very sound evening program. And it was quite a while. It took, as I say, it took me 10 years nights, sometimes going to 3 different campuses in 3 different cities because that's where the courses were. So I did a lot of traveling to get that degree. And finally got it. And that was a bigger moment for my father and mother than anything else. I was not the first to get a degree in the family. My younger brother got his degree 3 years prior to me. But it was a big deal for our family because finally the oldest son was making his mark.
This year is 60 years anniversary of Korean-U.S. alliance and also armistice. 60 years even after we signed a ceasefire. What do you think about this 60-year-long armistice?
I wish things would settle down there once and for all, but I don't see that happening, unfortunately, Doctor. We have some people who are rather, and I'm being kind, unsettled, running North Korea. I don't know what their motivation is, but their behavior certainly requires close observation.
Any comments that you want to leave for younger generations about your service and about Korean War and Korean War legacy?
About my service, I'd like to say that today's American youth should recognize that they have all kinds of freedom, which were not free. Those freedoms had to be earned by somebody, veterans. And that's something I'd like them to recognize and, if necessary, be prepared to defend themselves personally if and when the moment arises. This is true also for the Koreans, the South Koreans, the youth. I understand sometimes the college kids in Korea behave erratically. And if that is true, then I'd like to see them recognize what their ancestors went through prior to their births.
Vartkess Tarbassian.
Vartkess Tarbassian.
Yep. And this is your medal. Thanks.
Thank you, Doctor.